Hello everyone, welcome back to Church History. I'm very excited today because we're starting a new topic. The Middle Ages are over and we're starting the Reformation. Do you know anything about the Reformation? Have you ever heard of people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, or the Reformation in England with Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn and all the uprisings that took place over in England? Well, it's all part of the same package, and so we're going to be studying the Reformation in Europe, and then we're going to be having a look at the Reformation in England, and then branching off to see how the Reformation worked out, and how eventually it led to the English Civil War. So, but we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, so don't worry. The Reformation. We're going to be looking at the background to it today. What was the Reformation? Well, it was a revival, a gospel revival, a gospel that had become almost unknown to the church and the people in the Middle Ages. And it was basically a debate around three big issues. The first one was, what was the real authority in church life? Was it the Pope or was it the Bible? Second big issue, salvation. How were men and women made right with God? Was it by the power of the church and your good works, or was it by faith in Jesus and his works? So that your works had nothing to do with it. Your works merited absolutely nothing. Third issue that was really important in the Reformation was this: who really controlled nations? Was it the Pope, or had God delegated his authority to kings? The word Reformation itself, what does that mean? Well, it's an attempt to reform the church. That's what it's about. It's a revival of true Bible Christianity and its attempt to reform the church of the Middle Ages. How did the Reformation begin? Well, it was on the 31st of October, 1517. A German monk, who was also professor of theology at the local university, he crossed the town square and strode up to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral, and he had in his hand a hammer, a nail, and a religious tract known as the 95 Theses Against Indulgences. This one event started the Reformation. In the next few weeks, well, I'll tell you how it developed, but that's more or less the official starting point. Now, what are indulgences, I hear you asking? Well, they are payments that you could make to the church to have your sins forgiven. Can you believe that? For a certain price, which amounted to the equivalent of hundreds of pounds, they used to use ducats in those days in Germany, but for a certain price, you could be forgiven for almost any sin. Let me give you an example of the price list. If you wanted to murder an enemy, that will cost you 7 ducats. Just let that sink into your ears. You could pay the church to get you forgiven for having murdered an enemy. Okay, 7 ducats was about £700. What about if you'd robbed a church in time past? You got in there and you'd run off with the gold and silver candlesticks or whatever it may be. Well, you could be forgiven for that for a mere 9 ducats, about £900. If you wanted to murder a parent or a near relative, or if you had done that would cost you only 4 ducats. Why there was a difference in price, I don't know. You could even pay in advance for sins yet to be committed. So you could pay in advance for killing an enemy. You could pay in advance for robbing a church. You could pay in advance for killing one of your parents. And this is all organised by the church. Or you could pay for members of your family to be released from purgatory. You may remember that we've spoken a little bit about purgatory before, but purgatory is a place which, according to the church, you went to be punished for sins that hadn't been forgiven in this life. You had to have your soul purged, cleansed before you could get to heaven. So you could pay for people to be released from this place by giving money to the church. And there were advertising jingles attached to this process of selling indulgences. And let me give you a couple. When the coin in the bottom of the money chest rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Catchy. Or what about this one? This is my favourite. Drop your coin into the bottom of the drum. Heaven's doors open and in walks mum. This is the church doing this. You could also merit salvation in the Roman Catholic Church in other ways, not by trusting in Jesus and casting yourself upon his mercy. That was nowhere near enough. You could get time off of purgatory, get sins removed by things like giving to the poor or going on a pilgrimage. Have you ever heard of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales? Stories about various people who are going on pilgrimage to Canterbury Cathedral to have a look at the tomb and the bones of Thomas à Becket. That's what Chaucer was writing about. Well, the reason that they went to see his bones was because viewing his bones, going on this pilgrimage and viewing his bones, got you time out of purgatory, helped atone for some of your sins. Looking at religious relics like bones, some places like in a big church in Constantinople, they claim to have 2 heads of John the Baptist, which is the real one, if any of them. By looking at the head of John the Baptist, that could get you time off of purgatory. All organised by the church. Now back to this monk that we mentioned. Who was he? Well, his name is Martin Luther. And he was angry because of the behaviour of another monk. It's a sort of monk wars. A chap called John Tetzel. With permission from the Pope, he was selling these indulgences just next door to where Martin Luther was living, just the other side of the river from where Luther was. And by going and nailing these objections to the 95 theses, by nailing these 95 theses, which are an objection to indulgences, he was protesting about what Christianity had become. He'd been reading the Bible quite a lot. He was a Bible lecturer, and this was a very rare thing in the Middle Ages, as we will see. But he'd been reading the Bible, and he'd been comparing the Bible, the church to the Bible, and he was very unhappy. He was having very big questions about whether the church was on the right track, to put it mildly. Luther began to realise that instead of the gospel message of free grace, the forgiveness of sins through Jesus' blood, the church had turned into basically a money-making business. And the business that they were in was the selling of salvation. Salvation was being sold by the pound, or rather by the ducat. And over the last few weeks, we've seen some of the terrible things about the teaching and practice of the church. And in the previous 1,000 years, from 500 to 1500, it changed from being a simple assembly of believers who were supposed to love each other and encourage each other and study the Bible and pray. It turned into a place where the Pope was in charge, and the Pope claimed to be God on earth. It turned into a place where the Pope claimed to rule not just over church, but over the kings of the earth. It turned into a place where the Pope claimed to be able to forgive sins. And this power he shared with local bishops and priests. It was a place where the Roman Catholic Church taught that outside of the Roman Church, its organisational structure and the work of its priests, there was no salvation. Question. This has been going on for 1,000 years, had No one challenged the Pope over this. Nobody criticised him. Well, the answer to that question is yes. People had done, but most of them were either imprisoned, exiled, or put to death for doing so. So criticism of church authorities wasn't something that you did lightly. And opposition really began to mount from about 1300. The Reformation, as we've just mentioned, Luther nails his 95 Theses to the cathedral door in 1517. But from about 1300, people were really beginning to ask questions. And there were essentially four groups who were involved in asking these questions. The first was political thinkers, politicians. Second group was university lecturers. Third group were priests, so that's criticism from within the church. And the fourth group was breakaway churches. So briefly, we're just going to have a look at these four groups and say a little bit about them. So political thinkers, politicians, people who worked for kings and people who the Pope was trying to control. These included people like Marsilius of Padua. He was an Italian politician in the 1300s who'd been working for the Holy Roman Emperor. He was the senior secular, non-church ruler of Europe and the Pope's main rival. And Marsilius argued that God delegated his authority for the rule of nations to kings, not to the church. He said the Pope only had authority over the church, not the state. This caused consternation, and Marsilius was not popular. So there were people in the political world beginning to ask questions. The second group were university lecturers. These people had a real clout in those days. Universities were much more were listened to much more seriously than perhaps they are in our generation. University lecturers like John Wycliffe, who was a lecturer in philosophy at Oxford University in the 1300s. He is known as the morning star of the Reformation. Why is that? It was because his ideas inspired so many other people. And he would criticise the church because he was defending, from a university standpoint, the King of England, who was in dispute with the Pope over who really owned France. And I don't want to go too much depth about this, but you may know that the people who ruled over England were actually French. Do you remember the Norman Conquest, 1066? And a lot of people owned, these kings owned land and controlled land not only in Britain but also in the continent of Europe, in France. And there were arguments over the French people who were living there were basically telling the English to go home. To try and settle disputes, people would go to the Pope and ask what was happening and who was right and who was wrong. Wycliffe has a number of criticisms of the papacy, including, first of all, the issue of authority. The Bible ruled over the church, said Wycliffe, not the Pope. Secondly, he had problems with the idea of forgiveness of sins. He said only God could forgive sins. He also had criticisms over the material prosperity of the church. He said the church having great wealth was an abomination. You shouldn't be building great big cathedrals, diamond-encrusted robes and all this kind of thing. If you've got money, you should be helping the poor. So he criticised the church for its use of wealth. Secondly, in his studies of the Bible, he said there was no Pope mentioned in the Bible. You couldn't find the Pope from one end of it to the other. In fact, having studied the topic, Wycliffe had become convinced that the Pope was none other than the Antichrist. That didn't make him popular with the church, as you can imagine. One of the next things he said was that the Bible should be made available in English for everyone to read, not just priests. Can you imagine not having a Bible? Can you imagine having a Bible and it being written in a foreign language, which you couldn't read? That was the state of the church in his day. And Wycliffe said, let's translate the Bible into English or whatever land you lived into, your own common language, and let it be read like that. And to spread his message, he organised an army of preachers who are known as Lollards, and unleashed them into the countryside, into the towns and hamlets and villages, to preach what he understood as the gospel, and part of which was to criticise the established church of his day. This was a very, very dangerous business. If you were a Lollard, if you were a preacher, and you were caught by the authorities, you will be burned at the stake. So it shows you the power that university lecturers had in those days. What about priests? A third category, priests. Well, probably the most famous priest who rebelled against the church was a man known as Jan Hus, who came from Bohemia, which is sort of the Czechoslovakia region. And although he lived about 100 years after Wycliffe, he'd been reading Wycliffe's works and sort of took it to the next step. And reflecting on his experience of the church, he demanded of the church in his day a higher level of morality among the priesthood. The church was famous for its financial abuses, for sexual immorality. You may know about the sexual scandals, paedophilia that the Roman Catholic Church is famous for today. This is nothing new. He was critical of the drunkenness of the priests, a general appalling standard of or a lack of holiness in the clergy. And Hus, like Wycliffe, called for the preaching, for preaching and for Bible reading to be in the common language. And you just imagine going to church and listening to a service in Japanese and no one translating it. That's what it was like. If you went to church in the Middle Ages, unless you understood Latin, which only educated people did, you would have absolutely no idea what was going on. And he said, this talks to people in their own language. He also criticised the practice of communion. He called for Christians to receive a full communion, because at that time, lay people, the non-priests, received only the bread communion. Only priests were allowed to drink the wine. He said the laity should have both. Huss also opposed, and this is where he influenced Luther, the sale of indulgences. As we were saying, those documents of personal forgiveness from the Pope, which were sold for exorbitant prices. And one of the sad things about indulgences was the money was used for. It was often used for building projects, or even to help fund crusades. And Huss opposed the sale of indulgences. At the time, there's another thing that Huss criticised. At the time, people were beginning to develop within the church the doctrine of papal infallibility, that the Pope was infallible. It was in its infancy, and he said that only the Scripture was infallible. For his troubles, he was summoned to a church council to explain himself. And he was a bit concerned in case he was burned at the stake, but the church authorities promised him faithfully that he'd be fine there and he'd be fine to go back to Bohemia. But when he got there, they burned him at the stake. They said that promises to heretics don't count, and he was a heretic. So you had criticism from priests within the church. The fourth group of people who criticised the church were what you could call breakaway churches, and there were a number of these, and they were stamped down on very hard. And the chief example is a group called the Waldensians, These were led by a French businessman called Peter Waldo, who was active between about 1170 and 1184, who felt called to sell his goods and help the poor. He was living in Lyon in France, and the people that gathered around him initially were known as the poor men of Lyon. But he was persecuted for criticising the church and their behaviour. So he had essentially to run away with his little group of followers, and they went to live in the Italian Alps. And because his name was Peter Waldo, the people became known as the Waldensians. And a mighty movement of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people sprung up, and in fact you can still find Waldensian churches today in the north of Italy. What did they believe? Well, they believed things like this: every Christian had access to God in prayer. You didn't have to go through a priest. You could ask God for forgiveness yourself. You didn't have to rely on the church. That was regarded as absolutely radical. The thought that you could speak to God directly. They also rejected the use of indulgences. Baptism, they said, was to be by full immersion. Any Baptists listening to this? Full immersion in water, and it wasn't to be administered to infants. Now, there were lots of people who claimed that the Waldensians actually didn't believe that, but they were accused by the Roman Catholic Church in their day of believing exactly that. So many people believed that was a genuine accusation. They also taught that the elements of communion, the bread and wine, should be understood as symbols. Only the Waldensians denied the doctrine of transubstantiation. And have you ever heard of that phrase, transubstantiation? What this is all about, what the church taught, was that you would take bread. Back in those days, it was kind of a very thin wafer, a bit like a cracker. And when the priest said a prayer, that wafer turned into Jesus. Not part of Jesus, but you had in your hand Jesus. And if you had a plate full, I don't know, 100, 200 of these wafers, you had 100, 200 Jesuses on a plate. And when you ate Jesus, it gave you spiritual power to do good works, which helps you to get into heaven. It was known as the doctrine of transubstantiation. It's utter idolatry. And the Waldensians were among the first to call the church out on that. They also rejected the notion of purgatory and prayers offered to the dead, for the dead. They accepted the Bible was the sole total authority for all doctrine. Additionally, they said a formal church building was not necessary to worship God. You could worship God in your own home, get a group of people together in your own home or in a stable or other locations. You didn't have to be tied to the church and to its buildings. And these poor Waldensians, over 200-300 years, suffered terrible persecution. Hundreds of thousands of them died. There were church crusades. Remember I was speaking, I think it was last week, about crusades to the Holy Land to fight against Muslims. Well, there were crusades organised on a smaller scale to go and wipe out the Waldensians, organised by the church. Hunted down by Catholic armies, their crime being a separate church. Despite the bravery of all these four groups, these men and women and movements failed to make a lasting breakthrough. They failed to reform the church. But the Lord was at work. He was using these folk to lay the foundations for a mighty movement, a mighty event that would shake the world. And he prepared a time, 1517, and he prepared the country, Germany, and he prepared a man, Martin Luther. And we'll find out more about all these things next week.